So let's look a little closer at our other enemy during World War II, which would be Japan. We've already looked at our main enemies in Europe, which would be Italy and Germany. In Japan, it was the most powerful country in Asia. It had modeled itself after America or England or any other great powers of this era. It had beat both China and had gone to war with Russia over islands in between Japan and Russia. It had invaded Korea and taken over that peninsula, and it also invaded parts of northern China by this time period. After World War I, Japan had been a good citizen, signed all the international peace agreements that everyone else had signed. It had also created a two-party electoral system modeled after the British system of democracy, and things were really going great in Japan after a while. It was going through an industrial revolution. It had leapfrogged in terms of its economy and its industrial output over the rest of Asia. But what would it do next? Well, the problem, next slide, was that it had aligned itself so closely with Europe and America that when those countries slipped into depression, so did Japan. And when those countries slipped into depression, they looked for new answers. We found FDR, thank goodness. Germany found Hitler. Italy found Mussolini. As the depression continued in Japan and the country fell into despair and suffering, a lot of people lost faith in democracy, but more importantly, the military lost faith in democracy. And the military had always been one of the upper and power class in Japan. Next slide. This really started with the Manchurian incident. At this time, right before World War II, Japan had about 65 million people living on its islands. Remember, it's an island nation, which means it has limited amount of resources and limited amount of land. They were adding about 1 million people a year. That put a lot of pressure on the very slim resources they had, so they had taken North Korea for its resources, and they began to go up the northeastern section of China called Manchuria. That's where they were finding, this was a rich farmland and also had natural resources that Japan could use, both to feed its people and to feed its industrial factories. Next slide. Well, the army went into Manchuria without government position and took control of that area, which totally freaked out all the politicians back in Tokyo. The Japanese military made up some claims that the Chinese had tried to blow up a railroad, that the Chinese had hired the Chinese and Japanese had agreed to build up there. So really, the Japanese were just going in to protect the railroad. But things turned really horrible in Manchuria. Japan occupied it. The military declared it was an independent state called Manchukuo, and that this new state was under Japanese protection. Now, this was taking land from China, declaring it independent, and that Japan was going to protect it. All right, just to make it clear, this is like someone going up and taking over Florida and Georgia and saying these are independent now. All right, next slide. They sent businessmen over, and they sent farmers over. They set up a puppet state, which was under the control of Japan, not under the control of China. This is the guy they put in charge of Manchukuo. Japan then withdrew from all the international peace treaties that it had signed after World War I, and because the military did this without the permission of the government, the military influence grew. In fact, several government politicians were killed, murdered, or assassinated during this time period. And when there's instability in the government, who stepped in to make it stable? The military. All right, this is the end of part 1.